All right, guys, welcome back. We're on section 2. Yes, I knew you were just excited as I am. So, here's our funny internet picture of the section. Once again, we have a very good doggo. If anybody has ever worked kind of online or phone tech support, man, you know this feeling. Like, it is really, really difficult to work doing the phone tech support. That is one of the most difficult jobs in the world. Nothing but respect for the guys who do that. So, this section is all about policing cybercrime. Okay? So, how do the police do it? What are their jobs? What is, all these things. So, what makes it especially difficult for law enforcement to investigate, prosecute, etc., cybercrime? One of the first couple things we talked about in the first section, right? Underreporting, major issue for cybercrime especially. It's bad enough with street crime, with regular crime, with murder and rape and rob. Well, murder not so much, but everything from rapes to burglaries to auto thefts. There's underreporting there, and that's bad enough. It is worse with cybercrime from a numbers perspective. Okay. They can't investigate crimes that they don't know about. And if they catch somebody and they assume this person has done more, they can only prosecute them for the crimes that have been reported, right? So if one person victimizes 100 victims and only 5 of those victims report that crime to police and police catch the bad guy, they're only going to know to prosecute him for the 5 crimes, not the 100 he actually committed. Does that make sense? Another giant issue is jurisdiction, okay? It's hard enough jurisdictional issues within the United States. Let's say, the good guys in California, the bad guys in New York. That's hard enough. Once you add in international jurisdictional issues, it gets infinitely more complex. It gets way more difficult to investigate, to arrest, to extradite, all those problems, okay? The public is much more focused on street crime, okay? You ask people, hey, what kind of crime are you worried about? They're going to say, oh, I'm worried about, getting robbed, walking down the street. I'm worried about getting murdered. I'm worried about school shootings. I'm worried about this and that. And cybercrime is usually going to be way down on the list. Okay, so there's not this big public drive for law enforcement to go after cyber criminals until they get to some, they reach some boiling point essentially, and then the public's all about it, right? But they have to be kind of the big ones, the famous ones, the ones that have a huge impact. Then people are all about, cybercrime and cybersecurity and everything. But the normal day-to-day cybercrime stuff, the public really doesn't care. It's much lower on their priority list than most crimes. It is very difficult to investigate, right? There is a lot of technical challenges in trying to investigate who did what and when and how. You need to have a certain tenacity, a certain drive to follow a lot of these cyber crimes from beginning to end, right? There are certain very specific technical challenges depending on what kind of crime you're talking about, right? It costs a lot of money to have the equipment that law enforcement would need to investigate a lot of these crimes. For instance, I work in a place with a digital forensics lab, and each of our digital forensics investigation machines has something like $12,000 worth of hardware and software for each machine. So plus they have a yearly upkeep cost for the software. That is really expensive. So you really need to invest a lot of money into this technology if you want to do a lot of these investigations. There's also the problem of training, right? A lot of these law enforcement officers, God bless them, smart guys and girls, don't know a lot about computers. And for a lot of police work, you don't, and that's fine. But when it comes to cybercrime, you need specialized training in how to do digital forensics and how to investigate a harassment case, how to work with state and federal governments on cyber cases and different jurisdictional stuff. And you need to be trained on all that stuff. And training costs money, plus it costs time, plus the officers have to have the desire to do it, right? So that provides another giant level of complication. And then finally, there's support from the top down, right? Everybody from the chief to the assistant chiefs to all those people have to have a buy-in to the system. If your chief or your assistant chief or your lieutenant doesn't see that cybercrime is a big deal, a lot of these old school people don't see cybercrime and its investigation as real police work. Then they're not going to give you the support you need to be able to investigate and get that technology, get that money for the technology and send you off to the training and do all those things. So you really do need some kind of buy-in from the upper levels of your organization. Okay? But there are different kinds of crimes, different kinds of cyber crimes that are investigated at each of the three different levels of law enforcement, right? So in the United States, we have the local law enforcement, which is, city police, county sheriffs, all that stuff. Then we have state police, which every state has at least one state law enforcement branch. Most have more than one. And then there's the federal government, which has a whole bunch of different law enforcement branches. But each one of those three levels has their different focuses and their different important crimes that they are able to investigate and prosecute and all those things, right? So local law enforcement, the bottom level, these are your city police and your sheriffs and your, the boys in blue with the cars with the lights and the woo woo woo. Oh, in fact, I have, those guys, local law enforcement. One of their main jobs is to be the first responders, okay? So even if the crime is later taken over and investigated by state or federal police, it's usually the local police who are kind of the first people on scene. They're the first ones to bust in the door and arrest the guy and seize the evidence and all those things. As such, they really should be trained on how to handle digital evidence. Because if you don't do the right thing, you can either destroy or overlook or somehow mess up that first responder job of evidence preservation and collection and seizure and all those things, okay? So first responder training is really, really, really important when it comes to digital evidence. But also law enforcement will investigate and have jurisdiction over kind of person-based cyber crimes. And by that I mean things like stalking and harassment. Okay, the vast majority of the time, bullying and harassment and those kind of things are done by somebody local, right? So if I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm being harassed, it's usually going to be someone else from Atlanta, Georgia, because they know me from work or from school or from around town or whatever. But they're going to be locally based offender and victim. Thus, local law enforcement can have jurisdiction because both offender and victim live within the jurisdiction. They can investigate those crimes. Another one that they have that local law enforcement can be in charge of investigating is things like stolen computer equipment, which is kind of cybercrime depending on your definition of cybercrime. But this picture here is a very good example of the kind of crime that local law enforcement would investigate. So This person, whose Facebook account this is, had their phone got stolen, right? But their phone was automatically set to upload all the pictures that were taken with the phone to her Facebook account, right? So you take a picture with the camera, it automatically uploads to her Facebook account. Um, so she gets the picture and posts it, and this is the guy who has her phone. The guy was dumb enough to both steal her phone and then provide evidence of exactly who he is to the victim that he stole the phone from. So this is the kind of case that a local law enforcement officer would, investigate and make an arrest for, right? State law enforcement. State law enforcement obviously has a slightly larger jurisdiction geographically than local law enforcement does. So if you're a city police officer, usually your jurisdiction ends at the city limits. But if you're a state law enforcement officer, you can go anywhere in the state. Okay. Now in the South and West, that's a huge geographic area, right? So like if you're state law enforcement in Texas, that is a huge geographic area. California, huge geographic area. Up in the Northeast, not so large a geographic area. Delaware, not that big a state. But it is definitely going to be a larger jurisdiction than, say, the state or the county. Now, that means that they have a little more of an ability to, little higher odds that both the offender and the victim are going to be in the same physical area, right? But most of the time, the state law enforcement provides kind of support, okay? They provide resources to the local law enforcement or federal law enforcement who are doing these different jobs, right? So one thing they do is lab support. In a lot of states, the only digital forensics facilities are through state law enforcement groups, right? If you're lucky, you're in a large city police department, you might have your own digital forensics abilities. But for a lot of the smaller cities, counties, their only choice to get, say a cell phone analyzed or a hard drive analyzed might be a state law enforcement lab. And you have to send it off to them and, here's what I'm looking for. And then it might take months to get it back. But they also provide specialized units, right? So there might be like a state cybercrime task force, right? And they're going after people who make revenge porn in that state. Or they might be going after, stalkers in that state. And they, so basically these specialized units are usually created and given a certain focus. Sometimes it's very specific. Like, I want this state law enforcement special unit is going to focus just on stalking cases in this major metro area. Other times they're just kind of more broad. They're saying, okay, you guys are going to investigate any kind of cybercrime that happens anywhere in the state, and everything in between. But they can go after these things with a little more specificity. So, local law enforcement will say, hey, we've got these cases, and the specialized unit will be like, oh, wow, that case, we were looking for, cases to investigate that have to do with stalking. So give that stalking case to us, and we'll investigate it. And then finally, there's things called fusion centers, which are like intelligence gathering and analysis, right? So these people will take in data, gang activity or this kind of crime or that kind of crime, and collate all the intelligence and get it all together. And they'll see if they can recognize patterns themselves, but then B, local law enforcement can use that as a resource if they, need some kind of intelligence for some investigation or something like that. So state law enforcement does have a very big role to play, but it's a very different role usually than local law enforcement. So last but not least, we have federal law enforcement. These guys are the ones that do they have a national jurisdiction, right? So if the offender and the victim are both in the United States, Doesn't matter where in the United States they are, federal law enforcement can just go after it and perform that investigation and arrest those people. But they also are in charge of doing international investigations, which we'll talk about later on in this section. And those have their own set of incredible difficulties and challenges. But there are lots of different organizations, lots of different federal law enforcement agencies that do different jobs when investigating cyber crimes. And there's a lot of overlap, okay? The FBI does a lot of cybercrime investigation. They do a lot, like more than half of their investigations are in child porn. They really, really, really heavily focus on child porn investigations. But they also do all kinds of other cybercrime investigations. The Secret Service, they do a lot of cybercrime investigations, especially like fraud and money laundering and things like that, because the Secret Service's main mission is financial crimes. That's their kind of focus, and there's a lot of financial crime that overlaps with cybercrime. Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, these guys deal a lot with incoming, stuff coming from overseas, right? So whether it's pirated goods or viruses and malware or whatever, they do a lot of those investigations. PIS is the Postal Investigation Service. They do a lot of different online cyber investigations, including pornography investigations. Postal Service, because pornography prior to the internet was a lot of times illegally sent through the mail, the Postal Service got a lot of expertise focusing on pornography investigations, and they still have that expertise today. There's the Department of Defense Cyber Command, which investigates and looks into all attacks on kind of military and government networks. So if the crime involves a military or government network, it might be the military investigating it. And same with NSA, the National Security Agency. They do a lot of investigation if the victim was either the military or the federal government, some kind of, one of their computers or one of their networks. Make sense? All right. We're going to be back later with the second half of this chapter. See you then.